Oh, thank you, Daniel. It's a great pleasure to be back at this conference. This is the third one now that I've attended, so I really appreciate the invitation. So I have one optimistic observation and one somewhat pessimistic one, but I want to start by re-emphasizing a point that was made by several of the speakers in the panels this morning, which really has to do with Russian objectives. This war is really not about Ukraine. It's not about NATO expansion. It's not about an alleged threat that Ukraine and Ukraine's absorption into NATO supposedly made against Russia. It really is about the entire European order that came about after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the former Soviet Union in 1991. About this time last year, Vladimir Putin published a 5,000-word article in which he laid out his vision for Europe in pretty clear terms, and in which he reiterated the fact that that collapse of the Soviet Union was not a necessary outcome. It was a tragedy for everyone involved, that it really, in a sense, violated his sense of Russian national identity, which was both centralized, dictatorial, and very culturally bound. And it seems to me, if you combine that with the speech that he gave prior to the invasion, it's pretty clear that his real objective, the long-term objective, is to undermine that post-1991 order as a whole, not just in the former Soviet Union, but for the whole of Central and Eastern Europe. And I think that although he has adjusted his war aims following basically the defeat of Russian forces near Kyiv and Kharkiv, that he is still able to spin a narrative that he will be successful if he holds on to the Donbass and to the south of Ukraine. And between those two, I don't think there should be any confusion. The south of Ukraine is really the critical part. If they don't have access to Kherson, Mykolaiv, and those ports along that part of the coast, they are going to be blockaded. The Ukrainians are going to be blockaded. There's going to be this continuing food crisis, and that's going to be a point of strangulation over the long run for Ukraine. And so I think that Putin's strategy right now is one in which time is on his side. He thinks that they can afford to hold on for the coming months and possibly years. And at that point, the Americans, the Europeans will get tired. Already, there's a large part of the world that's not terribly well represented in this room, but is out there, all the Indias, Chinas, South Africas, that never bought into the narrative about this being a fight for global democracy and really don't care about the moral issues at stake. And as time goes on, I think he thinks that that's going to prevail. Now, the optimistic thing I want to say really does have to do with the military situation there. There's a very common view that this is going to be a long war, that essentially this is something that's going, and in fact, The Economist put this on their cover last week, right? That this is going to end up like another frozen conflict, like the one in Georgia, like the previous one in Donbass. The Russians are going to hold on, and it's going to be this slow attritional conflict that may go on for a period of years. I think that, so look, I'm not a military expert, and I can't see into the future, but I really do think that we should not accept that assumption too blithely for a number of reasons. The Russians have made some gains, some very modest gains around Donetsk and Lysychansk in the last month or so. If you look at that on a map of Ukraine, this is a tiny gain over a 2-month period, which has really exhausted the Russian army. The kinds of losses that they have experienced making those very marginal gains are staggering in terms of tanks, artillery pieces, and troops. The Donetsk Republic's forces lost 58% of their manpower. These are the most well-trained and battle-hardened troops that the Russians have been able to employ in this war. The Ukrainians, I think, retreated because they were running out of Soviet ammunition. They don't produce it the way the Russians do, and so they were literally not being able to fire back at the Russian artillery. They are now getting very sophisticated Western arms. If you follow this closely, this HIMARS system, this long-range multiple launch rocket system that the Americans have just given them, have now destroyed, 6 big ammunition dumps just in the last 3 or 4 days now that they've been firing. They're very expensive systems, but they are extremely effective. And I think that the initial Ukrainian advantages in terms of much higher morale are going to show, and that the Russian losses in terms of manpower and equipment are going to begin to undermine their position. So I just do not think that this assumption that this is going to be a long war is one that we necessarily need to take for granted. Now, this has a big impact on everybody's calculation, because if you look at the politics of what we are asking of Ukraine, it goes up and down depending on how optimistic or pessimistic people are about the military outcome. The moment that Ukraine's forward momentum slowed in April and May, immediately you saw voices in the West, Henry Kissinger, the New York Times, President Macron saying, well, this is the time for negotiation, this can't go on forever, Ukraine is going to have to give up territory. So it is extremely important for Ukraine to regain that momentum. And I think that there is a significant chance that they will be able to do this before the end of the summer, and that really changes things dramatically. So that's my optimistic point. The pessimistic one really has to do with the United States. We just celebrated yesterday our 4th of July annual celebration of the Declaration of Independence, and I must say, just following my social media feeds, a lot of Americans are feeling very bad about themselves. If you have been following at all the hearings that have been held by the January 6th committee in Congress, it is really shocking what they've uncovered. A lot of people believed at the time of this assault on the Capitol that this was simply a protest, a spontaneous protest that got out of hand, that Trump, liked, the fact that all these people had come to Washington. He wasn't in control of it. We now know that that's wrong, that he planned this from the start. It would not have happened but for his backing. The intent was to overthrow a legitimate election. He was told by virtually everyone in his administration that he lost the election, and he wasn't willing to accept that outcome, and therefore has been deliberately lying for the last more than a year, saying that he won by a landslide, and he's gotten 30–40% of the American people to believe that it was actually Biden that committed the big fraud in the last election, and they're now putting people in place to contest the 2024 election so that if it's close, they will be able to actually overturn a legitimate democratic vote. So I think the United States is headed towards one of the biggest, if the election in 2024 is close, we're going to be headed towards one of the biggest constitutional crises we've faced since the American Civil War. This is connected to what happens in Europe. It was pretty clear from a lot of testimony that Donald Trump was getting ready to withdraw from NATO had he been reelected in 2020. And I think that Putin sees, the return of Trump and his like-minded followers as the simplest route to getting to his long-term objective, because he will have then an ally in the White House that will basically switch sides between Ukraine and Russia. And so American domestic politics and the war in Europe, I think, are intimately connected. With every vote, there's been impressive bipartisan support for Ukraine up till now, but with every successive aid vote, the number of Republicans voting against has increased. And I think that, again, if the war drags on, if inflation continues, if you still have high gas prices, that support is going to diminish. And that's why the timing of any shift in the military balance is really critical. If something doesn't happen before the November elections, that's bad enough. If this drags on until we get to 2024, then it's going to have a big impact on Europe.